don't think I'm going to say anything else outrageous about the administration, so we might as well go. All right, so are there any questions on that part of it, just in terms of what I'm asking you to do now? Because most of the class from here on in is going to be your initiative to pick this thing up and run with it. If there is anybody who has not yet done so, please sign in. So I make sure everybody's present.
I actually have a question.
All right, but
I actually have a question.
Your sound is breaking up though.
Okay.
So go slow.
You know what? I'll just wait for you to respond to my proposal.
Well, go ahead. No,
I'll just wait.
You sure?
Because I know you can't hear me.
Well, if you go slow, I can hear you. There's just a little lag.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time.
Yeah, we lost you.
I'm having a hard time focusing on Ho Chi Minh.
Boy, he's a pretty easy guy to focus on, actually. He ain't Charles Manson, but he's interesting. What's elusive about Ho Chi Minh?
Fascinating. Oh, nothing's elusive. It's just there's so much going on around it. Like, do I write about the buildup to it? To when he started? How far back do you want me to summarize the French
First of all,
colonizing?
You're not summarizing. What you're doing is analyzing. In order to do that, remember what the objective here is. You're trying to come up with what you believe to be the best explanation for why decolonization happened. Okay. Now, there's no question.
Okay.
Part of the process of decolonization involves Ho Chi Minh's experiences, particularly in Paris, right, out of the country, and his radicalization in the times that he traveled to China, that he traveled to Russia, that he traveled to Western Europe. I mean, he was exposed intellectually to a lot of different anti-colonial theories, including American liberalism. Okay, and so as far as being an architect of an anti-colonial struggle, he's sort of the poster child for that, because I mean, he's one of those people who didn't really betray the revolution ever. It's when you look at Ho as an historical character, it's almost like he's written out of a novel. And again, a lot of his life was sort of mythologized by Hanoi, but he was unusual in the sense that a lot of the anti-colonial leaders themselves became tyrants. If you think, a classic example is Indonesia, and if you look at Sukarno and people like that, they just became butchers, and a lot of them were lunatics. Not a lot of them, but a lot of them were violent anti-colonial leaders, became tyrants. Some people would say, even of people like Senghor and Nkrumah, that they were tyrants, or that Nyerere, for all that he was looked at as this sort of gentle revolutionary, a sort of happy warrior of anti-colonialism, a lot of people argue that the forced, agricultural relocation into the idea of collectivized farming and all that kind of stuff, and by doing that by force, showed that he was really at base a tyrant, and that he was oppressing his people in much the same way colonial administration had done. The only advantage was that it wasn't alien rule. There wasn't the same alterity, but there was also tribalism. I mean, there were a lot of things that complicate that. I would argue that Ho Chi Minh and the people he had around him did an amazing job of mitigating those problems. Now, there were people who succeeded Ho Chi Minh, who themselves became tyrannical. But even to this day, I mean, if you look at a unified Vietnam now under nominal communism, let's say industrial socialism, you can travel pretty freely in Vietnam right now. It's encouraged. Tourism is encouraged. A number of your colleagues from a couple of years back have made trips to Southeast Asia and have gone through Vietnam, and they've all been treated well and had a great time. It's not like they were, roughed up checkpoints and stuff like that. They're not like Laos, for example, which is, I don't know if you've been following this, but in Laos, just recently, and largely influenced by Thailand across the Mekong, there's been a lot of movement towards civil unrest in a very repressive country, Laos, and with an incredibly aging leadership structure. People who've been with them since they finally became completely emancipated in 1975, and who now are, many of them, in their 80s, and a lot of them are idiots and kind of tyrants. You don't really see the same thing in Vietnam, and again, is it a wonderful, happy place? That's not the point. But given what they started from, as being an almost exclusively agrarian country, the only industrial area really being in and around Hanoi, and then to some extent, because of shipping and everything, right around what was Saigon, what is now Ho Chi Minh City. So yeah, I think if you look at this is one where you don't want this to be a biography of Ho Chi Minh, obviously, but you look at what did he have to do to mobilize essentially a socialist revolution when he didn't have an industrial proletariat, which is what the Marxist-Leninist model called for. How did he go about the business of organizing and sustaining, first of all, the Viet Minh? That was largely his creation. That I would start with the Viet Minh.
And when you see my notes, you'll see I have all that. My problem is you're right. It reads like a novel. It's fascinating. I feel like I'm reading a novel, reading about him. But then I do want to talk about why he is the way he, about how he was educated in France, and I'm finding I am turning into a biography. It seems to be all about him because he is largely responsible for decolonization and the separation of North and South. Well, he didn't cause the separation.
No,
I'm
he
just
didn't
saying
cause the
he
separation.
went north.
Well,
No. I know, but he.
No, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying, though. I know. I'm thinking.
I know that they were separated by.
Yeah, but I know what you're saying, and you're not really. In a way, you're right. He was trying to reunify the country. That was the main aim for him, was not merely the independence of North Vietnam, but the full integration and unification of Vietnam as a totality, because he understood, among other things, how important they were in terms of location in Southeast Asia, in that sort of Indo-Chinese peninsula, in that area. He understood that they had a tremendous potential for growth. He believed, when a lot of other people didn't, that he could take an almost exclusively.
And they didn't need.
Go ahead. I lost you.
And he didn't need anybody. But yeah, it's just that he knew Vietnam's potential, but he didn't know. Oh, that's all right. I hate living here. Okay, go ahead.
Well, anyway,
Go back to
at least you're asking the right questions, and it is ultimately, as an historian, if that's your emphasis, or as a social science analyst, if that's your emphasis, you have to make those calls. You have to make those informed decisions about what your emphasis is going to be and what the theory is that's going to inform your writing. Remember, it's not so much are you right or wrong. There's clearly many more than one way that you could look at anti-colonialism in Vietnam. So I'm not going to evaluate your work on whether or not I think you're correct. Obviously, if you have something factually incorrect, but that doesn't sound like the issue here. And those of you who I've talked to, it seems like most of you have, if you've done any research at all, at least you've more or less got your facts straight. But you may decide, Jennifer, you may decide, and some of the others of you may decide, that there is an individual who seems to be so important that it's almost like, you could say the same thing about Mao. Clearly, it wasn't just Mao, but would the Chinese peasant revolution have happened the same way without Mao? It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to imagine that. Whereas I think the Russian Revolution clearly when you go from from Lenin to Stalin, things kind of ossify, right? It's the end of the permanent revolution. All of a sudden, Trotsky is a pariah and ultimately is assassinated. There's a narrative there that's bigger than any one of those people. It's like each of those dictatorial leaders was a chapter in that history of the Russian Revolution and its consolidation as an aspirant to anti-capitalist empire. Vietnam, it's really about the struggle there is to mobilize a largely non-industrialized society to sustain an armed struggle for decades. And Ho was one of the key factors in the ability of the Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong to sustain that struggle. It wasn't just him, but he was incredibly influential all through the country. And the people in the South were terrified of him. The people who didn't support, who weren't Cong, were terrified of him. You say Ho Chi Minh, it'd just quake in their boots, or they'd want to kill him. So you might find that you're emphasizing a leader. Like I say, if you were to look at Tanzania, it's really hard to do that without understanding the intellectual orientation, if nothing else, of Julius Nyerere. It's really hard to analyze Kenya, without Jomo Kenyatta. I mean, there are these people who are so central to that struggle. Even in the United States, there's really nobody like that. George Washington isn't. He was a general, he was a military leader, and he was important. He became a statesman. But, there were a lot of prominent individuals, many of whom did not agree one with another. I mean, I'll give you an example in terms of anti-colonial struggle, one that a lot of people don't realize. When, at the time of the so-called, Boston Tea Party and all that, and then the promulgation of the Declaration of Independence and the consolidation that led ultimately to the United States Constitution, all throughout that, one of the strongest voices opposing that was Patrick Henry in Virginia. And including making up all kinds of conspiracy theories and everything else. I mean, most people think of, oh, give me liberty or give me death. There's so much more to him. But the thing is, he doesn't by himself characterize the revolution in any way. He's almost a force of reaction against the elitist, and this was largely an elitist movement coming out of the Boston Brahmin class, the John Adamses and the John Hancocks and the other Johns and, all those sort of boring people in Boston there, this is long before, the New England Patriots and everything. So let's just be fair about this. But it's one of the things that characterizes decolonization in the United States is that there were many different views of what an independent America should look like. And that's why we had so much trouble ratifying the Constitution. Some of your cases are going to look like that too, because there will be what, for want of a better term, why we don't apply this to white people, I don't know, but there will be what we will call tribalism, or I would talk about, ethnicity, ethno-nationalism. That was certainly the case. Regionalism is always important. It was in the case of the United States as well. Sometimes it's a towering figure, though, like a Ho Chi Minh or somebody like that. It has to be your decision. I'm not going to shoot you down if you're able to capture the contours of an anti-colonial struggle through the eyes of a single important historical figure, if you can make the case that that figure is so central to that revolution that it's hard to imagine revolution, anti-colonialism without that figure. And again, if there were an example of that offhand, I would say, yeah, it would probably have to be somebody like Ho Chi Minh. Okay, I would say even more than Castro, even more than Fidel Castro, because the sort of blunt edge of the Cuban Revolution was really more Che Guevara. I mean, everybody has to have a psychopath, right? And, they had one too. So I would say also really have fun with this thing. I mean, let it roll for a while. You can always edit it down, and I'm gonna get to look at a rough draft of your work before you submit a final draft and everything. And I can make suggestions then as well. There's a reason why this is 40 pages, because 20 of this is just hagiography about, Ho Chi Minh or, Julius Nyerere or whoever. And we can cut that down to 5 pages. But you did a yeoman's work. Excellent job, whatever. Whatever. Thomas Jefferson would be proud. But I do want you to try to have some fun with this thing and roll with it as a kind of emerging quasi-expert in this, since you're focusing so narrowly now on one case. The other thing, though, that's commonly done incorrectly when I run classes like this, this was my experience on the American side anyway, is that people run off and they start doing their research and they forget all the basics that we've talked about for the first 7 weeks of class. They forget that we have all these wonderful sources for conceptual analysis and these different models and these different things to look for and all that. I mean, if you look at the way that I constructed the Moodle page, I'm clearly screaming at you to remember the things we've done because they're there to help you, okay? A lot of your work, if you've applied yourself to the first 2 modules, a lot of your preliminary conceptual work is already done. Okay, that was the idea behind encouraging you to take extensive notes on the module readings for the first 2 modules. So you could refer back to those and say, you know what, that applies to what I'm trying to figure out, with my case study of Ireland or something like that. I'm trying to figure out a way to explain that. Well, there were a couple of people who threw Ireland out as a possible example of a kind of problematic case of colonialism and resistance to it. But I tried to get sources that wouldn't swamp you in reading. Most of them are introductory chapters, but that they could walk you through ways to think about your own case rather than just say, well, I read all those things and I made all those notes. I don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. Now let me go read about, Kenya. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just a question. I was reading through the recommendation, or not the kind of framework of the assignment we're about to turn in. And for the country that I'm doing, it turns out the collaborator class might not have been nearly as important. As in the people who are working with the colonizer might not have been nearly as important as a lot of other cases. Is that, I feel like it's still finding so far.
Let me ask you, does that sound like something normal?
It doesn't sound like something normal.
Then you know what? You found something interesting.
Okay.
Again, yeah, I mean, this goes back to, for those of you who took Political Science 311 with me, the research methods, if you find something unusual that you didn't expect you were going to find, that doesn't mean you've done a bad job. I mean, if you can build the case that, compared to other collaborator classes, they don't appear to have been that significant, someone else might disagree with you. That's not really the point. If that seems to be your best explanation, and you can substantiate that from the secondary source record, you've done an interesting thing. You've contributed to the analysis of that particular case. Yeah. So I would say, no, I wouldn't worry about it. I would be concerned about making sure that I had it accurate, but yeah, it's absolutely possible. You might find that, I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why there's no model that fits every case. Even if you think about the notion of collaborator class, that doesn't really apply to China, because China was more revolution than it was anti-colonialism. They fought off every effort at colonialism by closing themselves off. So sometimes there isn't really a very powerful collaborating class. It might have something to do with the structure of the colonial administration, such that they weren't using surrogates, and the suzerainty that they were exercising was done in more direct ways. Maybe there wasn't a lot of devolution of power, meaningful power, economic power in particular, to a comprador or collaborator class. It may be that that's the case. And again, I think that Kennedy mentions it, if not in the introductory chapter, mentions it himself. Howe mentions it in the Empire book. That's only one style of colonialism where you use think about, we've used the example of British colonialism in West Africa with the warrant chiefs and things like that. They became a very important collaborator class. There's no question, but that's not typical, so I would say you're probably okay.
Okay.
The main thing is to just think conceptually about what we've talked about and why that might be important. And it sounds like you already have. which might be one of the reasons why you're concerned, because
I'd like to think so, but I don't know.
yeah. No, well, you
Part
obviously
of me
look
was,
again, but
you started addressing the readings and I was like, wait, maybe I haven't. But
well, you probably a lot of this stuff. This is another common thing that happens with when the classes go well. By about week 6 or 7, students just routinely forget that they did not know any of this stuff 7 weeks ago, and they sit around wondering what they've learned. It's like all this stuff, you know. And again, it's not that it's just facts that you cram in your head. The purpose of all this is to allow you ways to model these things, okay? There are certain concepts, but they don't all work in exactly the same way in exactly every case. And so sometimes maybe Kyle's onto some interesting variation on a theme here that we need to take a closer look at. How do you think people advance, you know, historical narrative or develop new economic models or anything else? They find exceptions to a rule. And then they realize maybe that those exceptions are not as rare as they thought. So I would say, rather than worrying about it, I'd be a little excited that I might be onto something. I would, though, follow rule number 4 of Bill Hughes' cautionary tale, which is when you think you've figured something out, try to disprove yourself. Try to prove yourself wrong. And if you can't, then you are onto something. And that's fine. You know, more power to you. All right. How many of you in your preliminary work have come to the conclusion that on a scale from coercion to conciliation, you can kind of plot where you are as being, yeah, this was a violent struggle resisting coercion, or no, this was largely negotiated settlement. It was largely conciliatory. How many of you have been able to situate your case along that continuum? However, roughly, understanding you may revise it later on. Brett, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I was just saying that I can kind of place my case study on that spectrum.
Where would you put it?
I put it, it's an interesting place, but it's kind of on the violent side. It's like violent conciliation almost, because people kept using Afghanistan as a proxy. And so they keep utilizing opportunity structures brought in by new powers or from pulling from both sides, as far as mostly on the military side of things. They keep getting concessions from military powers to advance their own agenda and inviting in new military powers to create a new enemy. It's almost like they like fighting these kind of quasi decolonization struggles because they keep finding themselves in new ones.
Well, there might be another element to your case that also makes it somewhat peculiar, which is that in the case of Afghanistan, I think you could make a pretty compelling case that there was no unified national movement for independence, okay? Because as you know well, regionalism is really the important variable there. Localism and regionalism are the power structures of Afghanistan. I mean, we throw out terms like warlord and things like that, but it's about localism. I mean, you might know this better than I do, but I was really stunned when I looked at the history of Afghanistan to find out the large percentage of people who can trace their lineage back, say, 2 centuries, living within 20 miles of where they are right now. I mean, just that sense of permanence in a local environment. See, that's not nationalism, you know.
No, it's not.
So that might be why there's that opportunism you're talking about.
Yeah, and they just keep reutilizing. They just keep reusing it. It's like they recycle it every couple of generations. They recycle the same opportunities from outside influence. I mean, there was the one general when we were there. He'd been a general in Kandahar through the Soviets, through that struggle. He flipped sides from Russia to the United States, and then back and forth and back and forth. He was very opportunistic.
Who are we talking about?
God, he was.
Was he one of the guys in the Northern Alliance?
No, because this was Southern Afghanistan.
Okay, all right, yeah.
So he just played whatever side of the coin he thought was getting the upper hand at the moment.
Again, there's a kind of Machiavellian element to that, which has to do with understanding what is the source of your power. And there were very few people there who could honestly say that the source of their power was a central state. They've always been kind of a failed state because there hasn't been a lot of interest in forming and maintaining the apparatus of a modern state. It almost seems like the prevailing wind is blowing back 500 years or something, rather than, yes, let's consolidate a nation state and let's enter the world of nation states and engage in global commerce. It's, you know, I don't think that characterizes Afghanistan.
No, it really doesn't. Obviously, fairly limited perspective of my engagement with the just local people, but the way they live down there, it seems the local population just kind of like, it's tribalism. They kind of want to just be left alone by everyone outside of their immediate area. They don't want big outside influence on things. They're perfectly content living in mud houses with donkey carts and grapes and whatever they can grow regionally. It's bizarre but they keep fighting. They keep kicking out the new powers.
Well, okay, now again, let's use that as an example, because one of the keys to decolonization and indeed to the initial colonial process is contested territory, right? Every one of these is embedded in a history of contested territory. People will fight over land, and they'll fight over land, and they'll fight over treasure, generally speaking, a lot more readily than they will over what kind of God you worship. You know, the God you worship might mobilize people or might inspire them, but the fight is usually over treasure. It's usually over territory or some sort of wealth, some resource, or just land, which ultimately is the resource, particularly in pre-industrial societies. Okay, but what about the idea that some theorists have that encourages a culture of violence? Because you're always fighting to defend the one thing you have, that it can inculcate an ethos of violence, that violence becomes a ritualistic part of society, and that language is framed in contestation, and, you know, people from an early age learn weaponry and things like that. And you do find that. You find that in parts, certainly you find that in parts of Afghanistan. I mean, the old joke about Afghanistan used to be that, you know, when the weather got cold, they retreated up into the mountains and had weddings. And then during the thaw, they'd come down and fight. And it's a cliche, but, you know, people actually do, in part, take that into account. They take the seasons into account when they're doing tactics and strategy in a place like Afghanistan. Have any of you encountered anything like that, where there's a strong cultural variable, either because of this insistence upon localism and the sovereignty and autonomy of a local people, or some sort of ethno-religious enclave or anything like that, where you thought, well, this is what really sets these people apart? Let's see, Fedayeen. Yeah, okay, you could. The thing about Fedayeen, though, is that Fedayeen is often understood in the way that we use the word mercenary, except that you're not necessarily fighting for money. There are different reasons why people identify as or live as Fedayeen, but what I'm talking about is people who have some sense of kind of primordial identity, as a consequence of which they're more willing to engage in contestation over territory, up to and including, you know, anti-colonialism. And they maybe are more prone then to understand the need to resort to violence. Because we don't find it in every case, but we find it frequently, that ultimately to get the colonizer out of there requires violence. One theory is that's because the whole premise of colonialism is violence. If you look at Frantz Fanon, I mean, to him, it's like colonialism is by nature violence imposed on other people. Other people would suggest, no, it's not. It's domination, but it need not be always at the barrel of a gun, because that's hard to sustain. And a regime based on force is a brittle regime that will exhaust itself. Other people have argued that there are just areas where you're more likely to find a willingness to resist. Other areas where you're going to find that to be less likely to be the case, that people are less likely to resist. And so that's an important component, because if people are less likely to resist, it can be much more difficult to mobilize people in a sustained violent struggle against a powerful occupying adversary. I mean, again, to use Southeast Asia as an example, parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well. You go out and you find a bunch of farmers who are barely getting by. And, I mean, every rainy season is going to determine whether or not they starve. And, does the river flood properly or does it flood too much? And, do they have a good crop or do they have a bad crop? They're living this very precarious existence. And then you come along and start, filling their ears full of Marxist Leninist babble and arguing that they should pick up Kalashnikovs and go kill, French people or something. And, it has nothing to do with whether they're brave or cowards. It's just a question of whether or not they see that as relevant. If you're going about your business and you're farming and you're feeding your family and everything, and someone comes along and says, you need to risk all of that in an armed struggle, you might find a lot of resistance. And there were certainly parts of Laos, parts of Vietnam, certainly, I mean, parts of Burma, whatever. Well, Burma was a little bit different because of communism and other things. But, there were these pockets of resistance to that. It's like, look, a lot of them would identify Laos as a classic example. They were royalists, and their solution to any kind of oppressive power was, well, bring back the king, because that was something they related to. Most people of the soil are conservative. They're traditional because it's a precarious, hard existence. You're much more connected to the episodic nature of your own life because you're the one making the food grow, and that can make the mobilization for a struggle against, say, a mechanized European power very difficult, which again makes something like the Viet Minh in Vietnam all the more amazing that was because that was the precondition. Again, some people will say, well, it had to do with the brutality of the French colonial administration. They pushed too far, too hard, and they just invited that kind of resistance. Other people say, no, it never would have happened without a collaborator class who were playing both sides in and around Saigon. I mean, there are a lot of interesting interpretations of that. So what I'm wondering is, how many of you, for example, have gotten into your case enough to say, really, there wasn't a lot of violence here. Most of this was just kind of threats and, rattling sabers, and then there were negotiations, and then they gradually let them go.
That's kind of what I got. I think
Okay.
it's like the Wikipedia thing that popped up was like, 800 total people died during the entire conflict of 3 years, something like that.
Why do you think that was, Kyle?
Well, that was mostly because of the British policy in Egypt. The idea that Britain wanted to set an example for other countries. Well, it was mostly because the British were trying to execute a policy that was basically killing as few people as possible so they could effectively set examples for the rest of their colonies without a lot of violence. They wanted to have a low violence bar at the start, basically, and hopefully keep Egypt, which they sort of did after 1922 because Egypt wasn't fully independent.
No, that's right.
So they wanted to keep a low amount of, I guess, violent interaction.
Well, okay, so if you think about the immediate, let's say, the immediate post-colonial environment in Egypt, right? Who was in charge?
I think the prime minister, there's still like a puppet government that's British, but there's also the WAFS party.
Yeah.
That's like the revolutionary party as well. So it's kind of, I thought it was just the Egyptians, and I did like a little bit more research and I was like, wait, that's not actually true.
Okay, because that's what I'm kind of cautioning you. That does get surprisingly subtle and complicated, like many things Egyptian.
Yeah, I haven't quite gotten through all of that part.
Yeah, spend some time on that, because I think what you're going to find is when you look at who emerged as the at least, let us say, semi-sovereign power there, right? I think you're going to need to explain that in order to deal with the final issue of collaborator class or relative lack of violence or whatever it is. You'll find, I think, something in that explanation of who took power and how that might help you understand why that was the way it was.
Yeah.
Because clearly Britain wasn't done with empire, right?
Oh yeah, they have the Suez Canal right there.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
56. Yeah.
That's right. Because then, we think, well, why were there other examples of anti-colonialism against the Brits that were very violent and also were very coercive, because there were.
Yeah,
Egypt is a funny case. Yeah, sorry.
You could say that, yeah, I guess one of those examples, you could say that maybe the British thought that they failed in Egypt. And so they would go on to it. I haven't really.
One thing to look, I don't want to tell you what to do, but this actually makes a difference. Who was the prime minister? And of what party? In Britain.
Oh yeah, so there's a lot of different stuff that goes
Yeah,
on.
because when you put a Labour government in.
Yeah. That's what that was.
Again, I'm not telling you what to do, but one of the things that's really struck me about British colonialism, one of the things I always look for was, okay, well, now I kind of know, but I always used to, okay, well, wait a minute. Was there a Labour government? And it wasn't like they were completely anti-imperial. It wasn't that. But it was like this kinder, gentler imperialism. I'm being a little facetious, but you know what I mean? In other words,
yeah,
we can't always leave out domestic politics as an opportunity structure, right?
Yeah, no, there was this one weird piece that was like, yeah, there were like Egyptians that were just flat out like putting posters like in Britain, I think, like rallying for their independence.
Yeah.
I was like, what the hell? That was as weird as hell to me.
Again, the thing about Britain, for all that, it's sort of like America, we can say of both countries, there is a high degree of intolerance in some ways until you compare them to other countries at the same time. And then you realize, well, no, people are kind of encouraged to run their mouths. There's a long history of that just in London, with the towns, the people putting the soapboxes up, certain parts of parks where people were expected to just go out there and advocate communism and all this kind of stuff. The idea being, let them vent, let them get it out of their system. That creates opportunity, though. It created opportunity for the fascists in the 30s in Britain, right? But it also created opportunities for people who were trying to appeal to the metropole to decolonize. Paris in the 20s, same thing, right? It was just radicals everywhere from all over the world, okay? Because it gave them the opportunity to meet like-minded people to make common cause. Again, like-minded, not in the sense of being from the same country, but having the same sense of throwing off the imperial shackles and things, right? Well, there were Egyptians who were involved in that. Of course there were. Yeah. So you took on a tough one, but I think you're going to have some fun with it.
That's what normally happens anyway, so I think I'll be fine.
Yeah. And again, on all of these, you're not going to come up with the final, the final and best explanation after which we need not look at these ever again. I mean, don't build the wall too high that you then have to climb over. The main thing here, of course, is that by the time you finish this assignment, you simply demonstrate to me, you know what, I kind of understand how this works. Yeah, I might have missed some things, but no, I totally get this. We're not in graduate school, right? It's where people just are abusive with you over whether or not they like your work. I mean, it's really pathetic. You get these people who have no lives outside of their seminars, and they're just these hateful, rotten individuals. We're not doing that. We should still be able to sit down and have a beer together. Okay, so there is that question of where would you, and this may move a little bit as you analyze, but where would you place the struggle in that continuum from conciliation, to coercion, or from negotiation to violence? Okay, that's a way to think about a preliminary model. What were the ideological roots, if there were any? Right? Was there a strong ideological component to this? I would say, again, Brett, with respect to Afghanistan, ideology doesn't matter there. Am I wrong?
I mean, not amongst the people there.
Oh, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah, they're all pretty unified on that. But even then, there are some pretty, it's not so much in Afghanistan as in Iraq with the violence. And
well, that's different. That's a different world. Yeah, you're right.
There's a little bit, but for the most part, no, ideology is pretty solid there.
But in other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that in some of your cases, the absolute bedrock of this thing is ideological commitment. It's almost like religious dogma. It's like, look, this creates a sense of inevitability. It's why religion is so important in sustaining violent struggle, because there's a sense in which you can use a kind of fatalism to mobilize people and sustain them when things start going south by saying, no, no, we are destined to prevail. It's God's will. Or, you know what, this is scientific socialism. All the elements are here. You know, this is going to be a holly jolly dictatorship of the proletariat. If we could just keep kicking the ass of the French, we'll be fine, you know. But some of you will find that the struggle was less obviously ideological. There was no real program, or there was no thoroughgoing, stridently political dogma, as there was, for example, in China, as there was in the Russian Revolution, you know. And that's important. One of the reasons I mentioned that concept of negritude, that became a literary struggle to give intellectuals a kind of ideological valence. In other words, we're fighting for identity in terms of the arts, and the arts are by definition political. So there's an ideological component to that, but it's not socialism, and it's not Marxism, Leninism, and it's, you know, or like when you read Fanon, are you reading a Marxist? This is something that's puzzled a lot of people. Is he really a Marxist? I mean, can you really be a Marxist when you were trained as a psychiatrist? You know, are those things incompatible? Or are they fundamentally of a piece because both purport to be scientific? You know, so, you know, think about that. Is there an ideological component to this? Is there a sense of inevitability to it? Is there a sense of, you know, a kind of thoroughgoing program, which is what an ideology is, the purpose of which is not to tell the truth, but to mobilize people to sustain a struggle. This is the world as it should be. Here, I put it for you in this little green book, or this little red book, or this little whatever book. Sometimes it's that convenient. You know, Gaddafi with his little green book, whatever it was. And then another thing to think about, how important was military training of the colonized to the ultimate resistance? This becomes very important in places like Nigeria. It becomes very important with the Askari in East Africa. It becomes important in different parts of the colonial world. You know, when the French were mobilizing anti-colonial struggle, you know, there were tens of thousands of Vietnamese or the Southeast Asians who were thrown into these other struggles even during the Second World War. Well, it's military training. You know, sometimes that's important. And again, maybe there was somebody like Jerry Rawlings, okay, before the really violent struggles and the coup that put Rawlings in power. He'd been a flight lieutenant in the Ghanaian Air Force, right? That training and that leadership structure that advanced him, and the technological know-how, the westernization, all those things became very important to the change in power under Jerry Rawlings, okay? Sometimes that matters. Was there technical training? Was there military training or some other kind of technical training? Was there medical training? Often very important. But any kind of technical skill in the leadership stratum that might have played a key role in this. In Egypt, part of it becomes by the 1950s military. You know, when you have the coup carried out in Egypt by the young officers, clearly they're by far the most westernized, the most modernized, the most secular, and they're a compelling force in the early 1950s all the way through the 70s in Egypt, you know. And they were always trying to advance a secular state. If you look at Ataturk, you know, in what became Turkey, we're going to have a secular state with an Islamic people. Is there something like that? How important is religion? You know, might be a key to this. This is one of the reasons why the Middle East is so problematic, because even if you say, well, Islam, it's like, wait a minute, which Islam are we talking about here? Because that clearly mattered. If you look at Syria, and you look at the anti-colonial struggle in Syria, there's a strong component of what was called Arab socialism there, okay? But that wasn't the case everywhere. The Saudis didn't have anything much like Arab socialism. They hated it, okay? So not every Middle Eastern Islamic country is the same. And you have to make some decisions about that. I mean, there's not an endless litany of things to keep an eye on. What I'm trying to do is put these together as big parts of a model. So again, we have any possible technical or technological opportunity as a consequence of training or devolved, authority within the colonial power. Any sense of ideological coherence in messaging, any ethno-nationalism that could unify and sustain a struggle, religion, all these things, are the kinds of things that can help you, by answering yes or no initially, can help you frame a preliminary model of the case that you're trying to build. Okay. In other words, don't just start at the beginning and then read a whole bunch and follow through. Try to identify these elements for their presence or absence. Kyle is doing an interesting thing here by saying, well, I'm looking for a collaborator class and I'm not really seeing where it's instrumental, but at least you're looking. Okay. You may find later on that you want to retool that, but you may find, depending on how you explain it, I could kind of see that being the case. All right. Are there any other questions, either in general about what I'm asking you to do, or with you, specific to your case? It's very quiet. Okay. Well, I'm gonna take that as good news. I'm gonna take that as and I'll know better when I read your proposals. I'm not gonna read them till tomorrow. Tomorrow's gonna be a grading day, and I've got to finish all my grading in my lower division classes, and then I'm gonna read all your proposals. And in some cases, I may respond to you. If it looks to me like you're on track and you sound confident on the page, I may not even bother you. It'll be a judgment call. But always, from here on in, we might want to, we're going to take a few classes off to where there's only so much we can do now as a cohort, where increasingly you're going to be working independently. So what I was going to propose is that for next week, for the 10th, what we could do is I can be available here. If you're working and everything's fine, you don't need to come to class. We'll try this on Tuesday, okay? And then, but if you want to talk about your case, or if I've emailed you by then and said, we need to talk about your proposal, you might want to check into class. We could talk about it. I mean, there should be no trepidation about discussing your work with your colleagues. I mean, they can often be of help to you. Okay, does that make sense? Where what we'll do is I'll be here, I'll be online. The link is already there and everything. But if you feel like, I did a lot of work over the weekend, I'm kind of letting that sit right now. I'm where I want to be on this thing. I've kind of mapped out my time. I've got this other paper I'm working on. That's okay. Take a day away from it if you need to. And then what we'll do is we'll plan on meeting on Thursday, the 12th, kind of like we did today. And again, it'll be like, okay, what are you looking at? What are you finding? Because I would suggest to you that by next week, you should already have developed a bibliography. You should have some sources, and you should begin to outline this thing a little bit, where you could actually discuss your work with your colleagues instead of having me just yammering on here and then boring you. I don't want to do that anymore. So start living with that work a little bit. So Tuesday will be optional, but let's meet on as a class on Thursday. Is that right? The 12th, Thursday, the 12th. Have I got that date right? Yeah. Yeah. It's the day after Veterans Day. It's the day after Veterans Day. Yeah. Which we are taking. Remember, there's no class on Veterans Day. Finally, I don't think they've ever done that where they've given us a day off on Veterans Day. It's supposed to be a national holiday.
Oh yeah, it's a first.
Yeah.
Shinjeri was mentioning that one of my.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's a furlough day and I'm not getting paid. It probably is. We all make sacrifices, man. I'm not a veteran, but it's the best I can do. I'm old, man. All right. So, are there any questions on where you need to be or what we're talking about here? Okay. So, if you want to meet on Tuesday, you got questions, you want to do a little more extensive discussion specific to your project, we can have the time to do that. You got an hour and a half to do that, or hour 50 to do that on Tuesday. If you don't want to do it and you got other things to do, that's totally fine. Okay. All right. So I will then probably not see a lot of you on Tuesday, but hopefully see all of you on Thursday. Does that make sense? And if you haven't already done it, please do submit that summary, remembering that I'm not going to get to them until tomorrow morning. So make sure I have it by tonight, let's say, okay? All right. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.